parousia, what is Peter saying about Jesus? That he's the eternal Son of God forever, ever, and amen? No. What is he saying? You are the king. Why was Jesus executed? Well, let me ask you this. What did the plaque above his head say? On the cross, on the very cross, right? What did it say? That's exactly what it was. The King of the Jews. The King of the Jews. That term gets interpreted differently, right? But in its historical context. I mean, think about that for a moment, okay? And the question I have, at least, is who is this guy? This king of Israel who never actually sat on the throne of Israel. And how do we find out? How do we find out? And this is where approaches differ. And it's important to understand the difference in the approach. You have the insider approach, right? And Christians will explain to you how they come to believe that, right? But if you look at it from the outside, it might look a little bit different. If we're taking a historical approach, which I've tried to do all the way through these sessions as much as we can, how is it that historians find out what happened in the past? What do they look for? Absolutely, you got to have documentation. You need historical sources. You need sources, and the closer they are to whoever you happen to be looking for, or whatever event you happen to be looking for, right? And the more of them there are, and the more closely those agree. All of those things become very important. So what are our sources for figuring out who Jesus is? Our historical sources, okay? Our historical. Now, needless to say, Jesus, the Christ, has had a huge impact on the last 2,000 years of history. Would you agree with me on that? And continues to this day. But if we go back to the first century, how important was this man in his own day and in the decades afterwards? How important do you think he was? And he made such a huge splash eventually. Let's do this. We can divide the sources into three different layers, if you will, right? The broadest context in terms of historical sources would be the Roman world in which we find him at this time, right? So let's look at the Roman sources. Within that, we've seen that Jesus was a Jew, right? The Jewish sources. And within that, right, we can assume these are the closest to him, though, as we shall see if we have time, that claim is sometimes somewhat problematic. The closest sources, right, would be the Christian sources, the sources written by his followers. Okay? You with me so far? Let's exclude the inner circle, right, the Christian sources. Let's exclude the Jewish sources, right, for the moment, and just look at the Roman context. In the entire first century of the Common Era, how many references do we find to Jesus in those Roman sources? Zero. Not a one. Not a one. It's only in the first couple of decades of the second century where you begin to, the earliest seem to be letters back and forth between Roman local rulers trying to figure out what to do with these followers of this guy Jesus because they're causing them some problems. They don't want to cooperate. They certainly don't want to worship Caesar, right? Who, by the way, had come to be understood as a divine man. Well, there you go. There's another one, right? Okay, nothing from the Romans. Let's go to the Jewish sources. Jesus a Jew. Followers Jewish. How many references in that first century of the Common Era from the Jewish circle outside of those Jews who became Christian? How many? Wouldn't you think there would be a bunch? There's one. One. The entire first century of the Common Era. One. A Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, writing a history of the Jews, refers to Jesus briefly, and I mean briefly. This is what Josephus tells us, and think about it. If the other sources had not survived, Jesus would be a blip in history, right? Jesus was called Messiah. We know what that means in the Jewish context, right? He had some followers. He was crucified under the Roman official Pontius Pilate, and his brother James led his followers after his death. That's it. Just bare bones, right? Bare bones. So let's go to that inner circle. What about the Christian sources? What about the Christian sources? How many books in the New Testament? That's their book. 27. 27 books. Most of those are letters, also known as epistles, right? I had a student say once that he thought the epistles were the wives of the apostles, but that's not right. You hear so much. Oh. 27, okay. For the moment, see, we're narrowing it down, okay? Let's bracket the Gospels. Wait a minute, how many Gospels? 4? We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, let's bracket the Gospels out, because that's where we find the most information, right? Outside of the Gospels, 23 books, right? Books, I say books. Most of them are letters, right? Most of them are letters. One of them, at least, is written by, as far as we can tell, and New Testament scholars, biblical scholars, almost unanimously agree that whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, and did you notice how I said that? Whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, because we don't really know who wrote the Gospel of Luke, any more than we know who wrote Matthew or Mark or John. Those names, it seems, have been appended to the books. A very common practice, no hanky-panky going on here. Appended to those books later, right? Again, think about Moses writing those first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures, or not, right? Yeah, you get authority by doing this. But whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke, it seems, also wrote the book of Acts. Well, that's a huge chunk of the New Testament right there, okay? Who wrote most of those letters in the New Testament? Oh, Paul. Oh, Paul. You might as well refer to this religious tradition as Paulinity as much as Christianity, because it is Paul and Paul's version of who Jesus was, his opinions, his take on Jesus, if you will, that has so shaped Christian theology down, and not just theology, ethics, right? Authority structures, right? I mean, hugely, hugely important. And I don't want to steal my own thunder here, but I think Paul might have had something to do with how this originally Jewish movement became another animal. Right? That it took on this other, when we first mentioned Jesus' name, we had to translate from his language, right? Hebrew, or actually Aramaic, similar, to Christos, Greek. Was the New Testament written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews? No, it was written in Greek, right? Greek being, not unlike English today, the lingua franca of the time, right? But was it just a matter of translating the words into Greek? If you read Paul's writings, you begin to see, and I read his letters. Now, it's weird reading somebody else's mail. But I don't think he meant them to be private. And not only did Paul write in Greek, Paul thought in Greek ways. Now, what do you know about Greek mythology, Greek religion? Let me ask you this. Were the Greeks monotheistic? Just one God? Are there any divine men in Greek mythology? Where the gods and humans come together? It's a very common notion. It's a very common notion, right? And I wonder if Paul might be a stepping stone here. And I don't just wonder it. I'm actually quite sure of it, just based on the evidence. In Paul's letters, and this is not unrelated to what I was just saying about Paul, and the way that he understood Jesus because of the way he understood the world and humans' relationship with the divine, Paul doesn't talk very much about Jesus as a human being. In fact, again, if the Gospels had not survived, what we had to go on was Paul, right? Paul's writings, we would know almost nothing about Jesus as a person who walked around on earth. Paul talks at length about Jesus as Handel's Messiah, as the Son of God, as all-powerful, right? But to look at him as a human in a Jewish context, you're just not going to get that from Paul. You're not going to get that. For one thing, Paul never knew him. As far as we know, never met him, right? Never met him. Shows up later, right? So basically, if we want to know who Jesus, the historical person, was, not so much the Christ of faith, right? We're holding that off for the moment, but the Jesus of history, if you will, the sources we have to go on pretty much are the Gospels. I'll ask you again, how many? There's just one Gospel. That's what I was taught. It's the Gospel of Jesus Christ. It's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Why 4? One wasn't good enough? No, seriously, why not? Why 4? And do they all agree? They're historical sources. Do they agree? How reliable are the sources? That's the crucial question, right? The crucial question. And I always feel a little guilty teaching this religion. If my Sunday school teacher, Bertie Mae Bates, could see me doing this, she would probably have a little word prayer with me afterwards. I don't know, right? And I got to tell you, I went to college and I believed, what I had been taught. There's one gospel. The Bible, there's no error whatsoever in that book, right? Christianity is the only true religion. Every one of the others is wrong. Anybody who believes those other religions, billions and billions down through history, is going to bust hell wide open. Praise God. That's what I believed when I went to school. But then I sat in this world religions class, and then I took a church history class and really started studying the New Testament, and it just blew my mind. And I have to tell you, I went through a crisis period. Cognitive dissonance. Do you know that term? You know whether you know the term or not. You know what it feels like. It's like your brain has a cramp or something, right? Because what my mind was telling me, right? And what my heart was telling me were so different. And I did not know how to reconcile the two. And, it was a tough time. It was a tough time. And it's been over the years, really. Even while I've been here at Elon, it's still troubling to me, right? I get in a classroom, it's one of the reasons I love to teach, and get with young people who think new thoughts and think in ways that some of us probably don't anymore. There's a courage, right? And it's unweighted by life's experience. Now, oftentimes it's unaided by life's experiences as well. But I love being around young people because it's okay to think different. They don't have to think the way we do, and they know it, and that's why they give their parents a hard time. I'm sure that never happened to any of you. And in your own time, I'm sure you didn't do it to your parents. No, of course not, right? But to try to figure out a different way of understanding this that didn't jettison either one, that didn't just shut down my brain, that was not a possibility anyway, nor just lop off my heart. It's been tough. It's been tough. The Gospels, 4 of them. The one question we have to ask, do they agree? Do the 4 Gospels agree? Well, if you ask people from my tradition, absolutely they do. In every single detail, right? And you can see them